Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on climate change, love, and seniors, featuring Louise Comeau as our distinguished guest speaker. My name is Roy Culpepper. I chair the Group of 78, sponsor of this event. I'm making these remarks from Ottawa in traditional, unsurrendered, and unceded Algonquin Anishinaabeg territory, which continues to be home to Indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land for millennia. The subject of today's webinar could not be more topical or pressing. We seem to be dangerously close to tipping points as the rise in global temperatures and the melting of sea ice and glaciers accelerate. Resolving the climate crisis is likely to feature as one of the topmost issues in many upcoming elections in Canada, the United States, and many other countries and places around the world. The really huge question is there the political will to make the changes necessary to avert climate catastrophe? This is going to be more likely when there is a tide of popular support to take urgent and necessary action. And communications is key. How to communicate the urgency of our climate crisis, and how can we most effectively bring about change together? We're fortunate today in having Dr. Louise Comeau, an expert in climate and communications, to address these questions, including, what's love got to do with it? As Tina Turner famously put it in one of her last songs, most famous ones. We're equally fortunate to have as our moderator Susan Tanner, who is the vice chair of the Group of 78 and an expert in climate, human rights, and environmental law. Among her many other achievements, she led work with Friends of the Earth Canada on the Montreal Protocol, for which she accepted a UNEP award. Susan will introduce our speaker in greater depth and today's topic as well, before we open the floor for discussion. If you have a question or comment, please enter it in the Q&A box. Now, before I turn things over to Susan, I just wanted to make an announcement, and that is our next webinar on May the 22nd, which will feature as speaker Fergus Watt, the former executive director for the World Federalist Movement Canada. Fergus will be speaking about prospects for ambitious reform of the UN. Where is this going to take place? It's going to take place at the new Desi Zyka restaurant in Carleton Mall, Ottawa. It'll make available a buffet Indo-Pakistani lunch to attendees. Now, what's really exciting is that this is the first in-person event we are convening for about 3 years because of the pandemic made it impossible for that period of time. So you're welcome to attend if you're from the Ottawa region. If you can't attend, you can still register online. So that's Wednesday, May the 22nd, between 12 noon and 2 p.m. We look forward to seeing you all there at that time. Susan, over to you.
Thank you, Roy. It is a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Comeau and to elaborate on her very modest bio that was included. We met 32 years ago, I guess now, at the Friends of the Earth. And from that time forward, I had no doubt in my mind that Louise, with her intelligence, commitment, and energy, would make a very important contribution locally, nationally, and globally. And I'm proud to say she has the medals to prove it. She doesn't talk about them, but I'm happy to say, except there's some confusion whether it's 2 or 3 Queen's medals, depending on the source. So anyway, Louise has her PhD from one end of Canada, from the UNB in environmental management, and her master's from the other end of Canada, from Royal Roads in 2008. And similarly, she is now associated with 2 universities in different parts of the country, New Brunswick and Carleton. And her scope of independent research covers climate mitigation and adaptation, environmental ethics, pro-environment behavior, sociology of energy and energy literacy, gender, health, and just transition. And these are all topics that the group of 78 has been preoccupied with for the last 4 or 5 years. So it's such a wonderful thing to have you here, Louise. Louise's contributions are both local and big picture, from community blogs in New Brunswick to the expert panel on climate change and resiliency, which is supposed to tell the federal government what they should be doing. Louise will share today leading edge work on climate communication. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm just going to share my screen while I share a little challenge with you. I wanted to give you a presentation today that really situates the work that I've been doing literally as of Thursday, and I'll explain what I mean. I just noticed there's a date there I could have changed. With this idea of love, and let's see, without me using that word explicitly, what I might be thinking about as we go through this short presentation, and then I hope leave a good amount of time for conversation. Second thing I'd say is this is not easy to sort out what is the best path forward. I don't come to this presentation with you as some sort of all-knowing seer. I've never been filled with more questions and doubt. And so let's kind of take that journey together. If you haven't heard of Re.Climate, it's one of the two activities I'm involved in right now. It's located at Carleton University, and it's been recently established as a Center for Training, Research, and Strategy on Climate Change Communication. And the research that I'm going to talk to you about today was done on behalf of Re.Climate in partnership with a network of groups across Canada who do climate change and nature-based research called Eco-Analytics. So the key question that I'm framing this presentation around is whether or not we can build a social consensus for climate action. In the end, it is a numbers game, and I'm going to share with you some research that shows how that works. And the real focus of many people's conversations is, oh, you know, there's the committed, there are the people who are very aware of climate change and concerned about it. We would put ourselves in that category, I'm sure. And then there's the rest, often called the movable middle. I like to think about it more as climbing a ladder, and we'll talk about what those differences might be. So I'll set a little bit of context for the time that we're in. I understand there's some discussions about a campaign idea. And whenever we're thinking about a campaign idea, it's good to know where we're starting from. I'll describe briefly this research and some of the takeaways that come out of that, and provide some thoughts on what it might mean for campaign ideas that you're thinking about. So let's start with where we are. And just say it as it is. It's not great, and it is getting worse. If you look at this little model I've created, you know, let's start with the social context. The social context is really challenging. Obviously, we know that, with cost of living, the post-COVID issues, housing attainability, concerns about inflation, and one of the big kind of symbols, if you will, of where we're at on climate change is the growing discontent with the idea of carbon pricing and particularly a consumer price. This challenging context means that the public's attention is definitely distracted. That's not uncommon when particularly security values are triggered in people. And so what we're seeing is the social context is influencing people's ability to pay attention to questions around climate change. They're more concerned with day-to-day issues. But at the same time, we've got other factors. It's not just that it's a bad economy or people are distracted. We have what we call moderators, which are on the top and the bottom of this box I call unstable beliefs. There are psychological gaps, including, as surprising as it may be to us, that the public still has what we call distance gaps. Distance in the sense of the vast majority still believe climate change is something that will harm others, but if they do harm others, it will be far away. So not something close to home and close in time. It'll be into the future. They also still have, and importantly, what's called a perception gap. And this is basically social norms, weak social norms. When you ask somebody, would you be willing to pay, 1% of your income to invest in climate solutions, you'll get a number. If you ask them, do you think your friends and neighbors, what percent of your friends and neighbors would also put 1% of their income into climate solutions? And you generally will find that there's a big gap in the number. People perceive they're more willing than their friends and family. And it can be quite a large number, like 10, 15% with difference in result. And that is a gap in social norms. It means that we don't perceive that the people that we care about, that we love or that love us, expect us to be the kind of people that take climate change seriously and that act to help solve it. On the bottom, you see another moderator that's essentially, think of like a vice. And that is this whole category of growing misinformation, disinformation, and greenwashing. It is growing and it is influential. We're seeing research suggesting that it's potentially very influential. And as a result of both the social context and people being distracted, but also these psychological gaps and the misinformation and greenwashing, we are seeing, as hard as it is to believe, a decline in the number of Canadians that believe climate change is real and that it is human caused. There's a lot of debate about what might be happening here. One line of inquiry is saying, it's a solutions aversion, that people's ideological affiliations, whether, say, more right-leaning, for example, versus left-leaning, is driving them to be opposed to certain solutions. And, if you're opposed to certain solutions, it's easier to believe there isn't a problem to solve. Other people are thinking it's a process of motivated reasoning to deal with our cognitive dissonance. Again, a similar idea, we don't like the carbon tax. We don't want to feel bad about not wanting policies to solve a problem we think is important. So rather than increase your support for carbon pricing, you go the other way, which is the problem isn't that serious. Whatever the combination is, we know these factors are having an impact, and we're seeing pretty serious decline right now in support for climate policy. And it is not just carbon pricing. It includes like big reductions, again in the teens, in support for the transition to a clean electricity system. And we're talking rapid declines year over year. So sorry for all that sad news, but it is the world that we live in. I mentioned that Re.Climate's been working as members and as partners with EcoAnalytics. And you may be familiar, if you've been following that work at all, with some research that was recently done based on a survey that was conducted with 6,000 Canadians last November, that measured people's values, their social and political values, as well as their concern, engagement with climate change, whether it was behaviors, political support for policies, that kind of thing. The very capable people at the research team, Eric LaChapelle and Marjolaine, both modeled this data set and came out with some very interesting results. The left side shows you, if it is left for you, ranked by climate change engagement. shows that about 17% of the Canadian population falls within a group that we call progressive activists, people that we could expect to be like us, who are concerned about climate change, follow the news on climate change, whose social and political values tend to be more, as they say, egalitarian, which is to say left-leaning and progressive. 19% of the population is what we call civic nationals, so concerned about climate change, particularly impacts, but leaning more toward the conservative side of things, and I'll say more about that in a moment. Another group, 21% of the population, called centrist liberals, and they're a very interesting group. They are center-left, but a little bit less concerned about climate change in terms of this ranking. And then a mushy group called the disengaged middle, about 28%. And often people will talk about this movable middle. And so Eric and the team did a deeper analysis of who these folks are and found three segments. A concerned group, so about 48% of this 28% are concerned about climate change. Another 27% is more civically engaged, and another 25% is passive, just not going to engage those folks at all. But the next group is a 15%, what we would call fossil fuel conservatives, tend to be older white men, very attached to the oil and gas industry, and that, of course, would be a group, generally speaking, is ideologically opposed to climate action at all. On the right side, though, we're ranking these same groups by their social and political values. And what's so interesting, and I highlight it because in the end, I think there is a question of, do we love climate change enough to engage in more socially conservative environments? You see that the civic nationals are second in their climate change concerns, and they're fourth in their social and political values, meaning they are more conservative leaning, more right leaning, more open to voting conservative than liberal, than NDP, than the segments above it. And so the one thing I want to just point out is that people can be socially conservative and concerned about climate change. And one of the reasons I can say that is what we did at Re.Climate was we took this information, and when the survey was asked in November, people were asked one question that said, would you be willing to participate in a future focus group? And believe it or not, almost half the sample said yes. And so I was very doubtful, but we had no trouble whatsoever in getting people to agree to participate in focus groups that were pulled together by their segments, allowing us to listen to people who are progressive activists or civic nationals. They didn't know that's how they were grouped, but we could listen to them as they were and who they are. And we did 13 focus groups. And so let me give you just a summary of what I think from a communications triangle point of view, we can summarize. First of all, we know a lot of what the focus group showed us. The challenge is, why do we have such a difficult time operationalizing what we know? So the challenge is, to summarize again, we have these unstable climate beliefs. We have an extremely weak understanding of Canada's global contribution to climate change, leading to perceptions of unfairness, rationalization about why Canada shouldn't have to do anything, deep solution skepticism, and a lot of confusion about the kind of information people are being exposed to. That's a summary of some of the things I heard from people within the focus groups. So we have a choice. We can engage more segments of the Canadian population or lose the numbers game. We can change our approach and tone to engage more socially conservative Canadians, and I'll share with you what I think that looks like. To do that, we may have to do something that is contrary to where many of us go, which is to avoid finger pointing, in particular in favor of messaging that is more about we, how we all contribute, what all of our fair share might be. So I'll say a bit more, of course, about that. We also have an opportunity to hand the mic. We asked people who they trusted and had a fascinating conversation about what people mean when they say they trust scientists. So I'll talk more about that. We definitely have to commit to doing everything we can to counter the solutions, misinformation, and greenwashing that's going on. We do know that the less engaged segments like positive messages and messages that grab their attention. And they're looking to situate Canada's climate action in terms of Canada's place in the world. Each of these hints at some possible opportunities for you if you're thinking about participating in something around the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. But we're going to have to stay real. And I'm going to share with you what I think we have to do to build social consensus. So I mentioned this movable middle idea versus thinking of a ladder. The math is pretty simple. We can't win. We can't build this social consensus that Roy talked about if we're engaging 17% of the population. It's not happening now. Even with those people who are on side, we don't really have them super mobilized. But we're never going to win the numbers game with 17%. So that means right off the bat, we have to build consensus on climate action within other segments. And that means asking ourselves a question about whether or not we're willing to engage with and speak to, learn to be friends with people who are more socially conservative than we are or might be. My suggestion is we do think more ladder of engagement than movable middle, and I think it offers us value because the focus group showed that people who are in this progressive activist box, the 17% of folks, they really are different. They are more advanced. They're higher up on the ladder, if you will. They are interested in climate change messaging that is detailed. They want to hear more about climate progress. They want to feel that there's some efficacy and agency here, that we're getting somewhere. But importantly, they also are open to holding polluters accountable. And that's important because all the other segments are more motivated by holding polluters accountable than they are about hearing about climate progress. They're much more needing of stories that are about the we and the us. And they need to know why Canada is doing something on climate and how does that compare to what other countries are doing. They definitely don't react well to negative messaging. They want positive messaging. They want to hear from frontline scientists, health professionals, and technology experts. So people who install your heat pump or your solar unit or that kind of thing. I mentioned at the beginning that it's not an easy time. The sad part of the focus groups for me was that messaging that I wish wasn't working so well is just working really, really, really well. Without any provocation, this is basically what people said over and over again. Canada, total fatalism. Canada's a small player. What Canada does won't make any difference. Climate change is a global problem. No one cares what Canada does. What we do has absolutely no impact. And I can tell you this is from all segments. This is not just from the less engaged. On the solution side, it's the same challenge. Climate solutions are inaccessible, they're unaffordable, they're unattainable, they don't work. We're being unrealistic, the timelines especially, and a regular call for being more realistic. We also know that when we're trying to communicate, we're trying to avoid certain pitfalls. Yet, knowing that anybody who's communicating, I mean, when we do it every day, we're trying to raise a sensitive topic with somebody, the first thing you want to do is not piss them off. And yet our communication is regularly triggering resistance. And the kind of resistance I'm talking about is the kind that gets people's identity backs up. And we're often in our language and our communications triggering reactance, particularly around some of these solutions where people perceive them as threats to their freedom or having control over their lives. There are boomerang effects where we think we're doing something. I see this all the time. I think I have a great message. I've got a great story to tell, and it has the opposite effect of what I hoped for. We're seeing a lot of rationalization. People are counter-arguing. You can see right off, there's the social identity threats. There's the solution skepticism that I talked to, and all of these fatalistic too late perceptions. So let me just read you This is no point in doing focus groups for the math, right? It's what they say. So Rob, a male 45 to 50-year-old in Manitoba, says, it's like, well, for all you people living in the past and, just keep living the way you are with your gas car and your old house. And yeah, basically the connotation is you're kind of like a loser. You're not with it. I don't like that. And this was in response to narratives about the affordability of climate solutions. Just go get your heat pump and renovate your house and make it more efficient. And next time you're in the market, get yourself a plug-in hybrid or an EV. And that's the kind of reaction that we were getting. And it was pretty consistent across the board. It was kind of sad, really, to see this solution skepticism. There's a lot of misinformation, but it's not just about misinformation. And so no matter what it was, whether it was EVs, whether it was heat pumps, whether it was targets, there was a lot of resistance, lots of reaction. It's the mining issues and it's the lack of electricity supply and no charging stations and heat pumps don't work in the cold and my electricity bill will go out the roof. And here's just Brett, who's from Ontario, talking about this. And this is a progressive activist. I think it's possible, but I think they've got a ton more development on them, such as the distance. He's talking EVs. That or the range of cars, and even more so, charge time. I can't see to go from here to Halifax. It's 4 hours. And if I have to stop like after 3 hours and stand and wait for 5 hours for my car to recharge and to get to the rest of the way, hello, I'm not leaving. And that is a pretty consistent issue. And so you think, how might we kind of move beyond that? Well, it may be that we have to put a bit of water in our wine in our technology or technical or techno optimism. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. The one place where everybody agreed, if you're careful, is that we should hold polluters accountable, which is exciting to know that there's potentially a message that is common across all segments, because nobody's going to have the budget or the capability to start communicating to all of these individual segments. We got to find a way to bring everybody together as best one can. Progressive activists, they kind of like the climate progress way of talking, and I'll share that narrative with you. But they also kind of, they're down for the polluter pay. And they're more willing to target the oil and gas sector. And when you think about the non-fossil fuel proliferation treaty, you're definitely targeting oil and gas producing countries like Canada and this sector. But there's a lot of risk around that. And I'll explain some of the things that I saw in the focus groups. One of the things that really stunned me was just how effective the advertising has been by the Pathways Alliance. There's so much misinformation about the oil and gas industry's role in climate change now that basic facts about the sector's emissions growth profile were doubted. Because I had heard in the focus groups, that people didn't know about the sector's contribution, I created a new visual in some focus groups that we used to retest things, and people were like, "Well, I've never heard that before." And this was data from Environment Canada's National Inventory Report, like basic facts, very difficult. Alberta residents were very confused, like in saying things like, well, that's just so opposite what we hear. They're very worried if we hold polluters accountable, well, it'll just cost us in the end. But mostly they want to know, why is Canada doing this? You would have thought that it was obvious why Canada's doing it, but it's not. And so one of the things that we can think about, especially as you're thinking about your campaign idea, is what are our opportunities to talk about we are all in this together. I mentioned that targeting the oil and gas sector has some reactance challenges, and everybody but the progressive activists did not like it at all. They challenged, finger pointing, blaming, vilifying. They perceived it as a tax on an oil and gas sector they think is important to Canada, and of course a tax on Alberta. And because of misinformation, disinformation, and the greenwashing, especially from the Pathways Alliance, people are really confused. Like, I don't know what to believe. Fortunately, health professionals were really trusted. And I think there's an opportunity to, along the pathway of fossil fuels, health, climate change. There's a pathway there. If we can think about how to balance and figure out, do we target or not target? If we're targeting, how are we doing? I'm not going to read you this narrative. I'm just going to give you an example of what the underlying text of what I mean when people doubt the basic facts. I thought, oh, this is going to work perfectly. And it did help, where I used the data from Government of Canada to basically show that the increase in Canada's emissions from 1990 to now was primarily from the oil and gas sector. But because people were freaking out about finger pointing, I put in and transport sector. That seemed to calm things down a little bit. And then that naturally led me to say, well, let's hold them accountable with regulations to cap oil and gas pollution and make auto manufacturers produce less polluting vehicles for Canadians. And that did help as well. But people are like, well, how does that work? And so, even an idea of regulation may need to be explained. And I mentioned this climate progress idea, and I'm just going to note there with the underlying text that what we tried to do in this first round of this narrative was be specific. People said, we want some detail. Give us some detail. So in this one, it was copying a narrative from a group called Potential Energy. Everybody's probably heard about their later is too late idea. And one of their narratives that performed well talked about, if we reduce pollution 10% every year, we can end climate change before it's too late for our kids. And here's how a progressive activist reacted to that. Saying it's too late because they had just seen that other narrative. I thought that was pretty soft pitch. This one I love, that it's starting strong with something positive. And I like that it has some very specific activities because I think it makes it real, makes it quantifiable in a way. And it's kind of a nice springboard to having a very specific target and what that means. In terms of the impact, the positive impact. So I really like that. I love the closing line because it encapsulates everything, which was, we can end climate change before it's too late for our kids. We need less talk and more action. So Penny really liked this, but a lot of people complained about that particular target. So we tried again with a rewrite. I won't read all of this to you, simply to say that test, no matter what we think we're doing, no matter what we think we're saying, it may work. In this case, I tried to talk about heat pumps, for example, working in minus 30 temperatures. And people found it was okay, but a little too optimistic. And this is the challenge. How do we tell a story, a positive story, but not look like we're kind of over the top, kind of avoiding the challenge that, I don't know, I have an EV vehicle and I tell you I hate traveling because the charging infrastructure doesn't work. The other thing I wanted to just mention is this later is too late idea. It really was the big pivotal idea out of Potential Energy's global research with Yale University. And it really was the love story. That we are doing what we're doing because it's putting our children's futures at risk. And I was stunned at what people said about this narrative. First of all, it triggered fatalism. And I never in a million years would have thought that. And here just from James, I think the problem is that once you kind of personalize it, which is this narrative is all about us as individuals, it's like it's too big of a problem. And I can't change the climate for my kids or my grandkids. And then Donald says, like I said, I believe we're at that tipping point where we have to mitigate the damage at this point. So my point is that there's a lot of fatalism in the population. We know it's growing. And one of the reasons I started by saying I'm living with a lot of doubt is that it is not easy at the moment to have a conversation with people about climate change. There are pitfalls and potholes and all sorts of things, which is why I keep saying the face-to-face, the gentle, the care conversation is I think going to get us further than the attack mode. Because so many people were talking about, why is Canada doing this? And, what's Canada's role in the world? We're useless. We can't do anything. I rewrote a narrative and tested it in the final two groups to see what people did. And I'm not going to read this to you. These are all here for you. The deck will be shared. What I wanted to do was just highlight the pitfalls of making the wrong comparison. I thought this was a right on comparison. So on the right, you'll see in the underlined text, I said, according to a global database, our per person emissions are almost 60% higher than Norway, another cold climate country with a major oil and gas industry. Our total emissions also put Canada in the top 10 of the world's biggest polluters. So one thing here worked and one thing didn't work, and you might guess which one. The comparison to Norway, which I thought was a no-brainer, did not work. People said it's a much smaller country, they got a different culture, like they were just challenging me all over the place. So we do need to make comparisons. We need to compare Canada, but we need to figure out carefully which countries we're comparing to, whether it's the US or other countries. But what really did the trick, which is what I had hoped would happen, was explaining that Canada is a top 10 climate polluter. People were stunned by that. In fact, some people just said, I can't believe that. Like, I'm not hearing that at all. Like, they perceive that we're a good guy. And I do believe that if you're going to think about a campaign that is international in dimension, one of your biggest stories to explain all the ways that Canada is a top 10 of the world's biggest climate polluters, whether it's our per capita emissions, which puts us in the top 1, 2, or 3, depending on what you're looking at. We're the top 10 in historical emissions, top 10 in our absolute emissions. We're a top 10 G7 country in terms of GDP per capita. We're a top 10. And so that's an opportunity. The other opportunity is that this top 10 business gets at over 1.5% of emissions. Well, the reality is, if everybody in the world, didn't do anything because they were in the top 2%, 50% of global emissions wouldn't even be dealt with, right? So it's a ridiculous argument, but we're going to have to frame it up. We're going to have to figure it out. So let me wrap this up by just saying, I think it's important that we stop the bleeding. Yeah, it's a bad social context. Yes, we have to grab attention with all the smarts that we have at our disposal. We've got to close these gaps and make people sense that climate change is happening now. It's urgent today, that it will affect them and is affecting them now. We've got to up our game on countering the counter campaigning, the misinformation, the greenwashing, and some groups are better suited to that than others. We've really got to establish that climate action is fair. Unfortunately, the carbon price does not lead to that. We need to continue to be confident in a polluter pay, hold polluters accountable framing. But we also have to build confidence that what we're doing is and has the potential to succeed. When we read technology diffusion literature, there's an S curve, right? And we have a hype phase, and we certainly, I would say, have been for a while in the hype phase about EVs and electrification and all this wonderful stuff. And then there's what they call the trough, where kind of reality hits home. We're running into bumps along the road like we are. The chargers don't work and there's not enough and all that good stuff. And then you restabilize at a bit of a lower level. You go up in your curve and lower than the hype phase, the more realistic phase. And so, misinformation, disinformation, and greenwashing is having an influence, but so is this S curve, just natural thing. And we may have to think about how we communicate, counter the misinformation, but also be saying, let's be more humble about the way we communicate. Talk about the fact, there's bumps in the road. It's worth doing. It's worth doing together. These are investments in our future, and I'll say a little bit more about that now. So I've identified some tensions, and you might wonder by this point in the presentation, you'll be where I am, which is, what do we do? And so we do have some tensions to consider. There are different perspectives, and I'm in Wakefield right now. We've got 30 of the smartest communications people coming together. I'm presenting a lot of this material to them tomorrow. So I may have more answers in the future. But there's this tension between holding companies responsible and accountable and targeting the oil and gas. It is legitimate to target the oil and gas sector because they're the biggest problem from an emissions point of view and certainly from a growth point of view. But it's triggering to those less engaged segments. And we know from the numbers game, we can't get there from here. We can't do it without bringing in more segments. People in the focus groups, if I take them at their word, said, we all use their products. We shouldn't be let off the hook. Where's the we in the they? Some people are saying, oh, don't be naive, Louise. This is just a plot by industry to diffuse their responsibility, and it's a sign that they're winning the game, that consumers are taking their responsibility on. Do focus groups prove that point, or do we just rob people of their agency? I can tell you where I land on this. I don't buy it for 1 minute. I actually think there is a we in the they. I do think it's not right for us to rob people of their agency, but I do think that the pathway is to fair share, and oil and gas sector as well as other sectors are not doing their fair share. Can we get out of our comfort zone, and can we communicate with social conservatives? That's going to mean a certain level of discipline, because they have a different perspective on all sorts of social questions that are natural for more egalitarian people to think about. They lean more toward traditional family values. They don't understand justice. Just using the term climate justice is not understood. They do get fair share. They are concerned about climate change. They like more social order. Could we be in a position where we might restrain our own particular values for a moment, or at least share our values, but not dismiss their values? How do we have this conversation and bring them into the story? Can we agree on messaging and tactics to collaborate on? One of the things that I know from researchers who look at conservative messaging and campaigning, I just liken it to the Borg. Like, they are, if the message is axe the tax, then it's axe the tax every day, every day, every day, every day. When they say push the button, everybody pushes the button. When they say share this document, everybody shares this document. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of discipline in the networks that we are all involved in. I mentioned, I think, the need to add a dash of humility to our technology optimistic communication. There is a challenge. It's not easy getting a heat pump. It may not work in a really cold climate. You do probably need a backup depending on where you are. But can we be humble and talk about the bumps along the road, but within a frame that it's inevitable? We're on this path. We got to figure it out. Let's build our excitement about figuring that out together. We've talked about in other environments that I'm working in about whether or not, because the social conservatives, particularly these civic nationals that I'm the most interested in, I think they're the people. Spontaneously in the focus groups, they kept talking about they're freaking out about the wildfires. And what's interesting is some other communicators are saying, our wildfire is an apocalypse trap, right? If we go in at the wrong time, because there's a before the wildfire and during the fire and what you should say after the wildfire, is this a path to engage the less engaged? I can tell you from the focus groups, it sure sounds like it. But their engagement is not where we would leap automatically to policies and a non-proliferation treaty. They're only able to take it so far. And that is to, forest is on fire, it's affecting air quality. We know climate change has something to do with that, but they don't automatically leap to the oil and gas sector. I'll say something more about that in a moment. So how do we engage in these key moments without triggering fatalism and debilitating eco-anxiety? How do we build agency? One idea, our tendency is to show a lot of imagery about everybody escaping these fires. One suggestion is that, in fact, we show imagery of people working together, right? Building that narrative of we're in this together, we can help each other, we can get through this. I mentioned the health and air quality dynamics. People are not making the connection to fossil fuels. And it's going to take some pretty big skills to start making those connections. And when we asked in the focus groups, who would you listen to? They're smart. It's a very tight connection. It's not just anybody. They want to hear from forest professionals, wildland firefighters, the health professionals. And so in many ways, one of the suggestions is that you noted in my triangle at the beginning, or you may not have noted, but I'll repeat here, is we need to hand the mic. There's certain things that we can be good at saying, but there's certain things that other people need to be talking about. And these less engaged segments really want to hear about it. So what might we do? The progressive activists, they're there, they're worried, but nobody's really asking them to join a campaign. This may be your group. And this may be a thing in terms of non-proliferation treaty that they're interested in thinking about. But for the rest of the folks who are not yet engaged, we do need to redirect them from the carbon tax, and linking it to wildfires, trying to counter misinformation and greenwashing may help do that. We also at Re.Climate are going to do more testing, because a lot of what I've shared with you is really hot off the press. Like, we really finished focus groups last Thursday. And I need to do more work to make sure that we're getting it. We're seeing what influence, holding polluters accountable. We can all do our fair share. Canada's place in the world. Canada's not acting alone. Solutions work. We're trying to figure out. But I'm telling you, I think if you can think about messaging and ways, conversations you can have with people that are sensitive to those ideas, because you're not going to be, running multi-million-dollar campaigns. None of us are. But that face-to-face, friends and family conversation can include those items and can be very powerful. So let me just finish up with some ideas that I have about this concept of connection to a fossil fuel, I should say, non-proliferation treaty. Clearly, there's an opportunity to situate Canada internationally. There's an opportunity to frame a campaign around holding polluters accountable, in this case, Canada, and its role as the fourth largest, I think third or fourth largest, depending on oil or gas, exporters in the world. There's an opportunity to situate Canada's fair share in a global context and to tell stories about what other countries are doing. I really think this is important. Over and over and over. It's China, 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 China. Well, let's talk about what China's doing. The perception is they're doing nothing, and that the only people doing anything about climate change is some poor guy in Canada paying a carbon tax. We do have an opportunity to profile scientists, health professionals, and your own lived experience within your networks. And to the degree that your group includes people who come from science or health backgrounds, by all means, put them in front. Let's start having those folks be seen to be engaging here. On the challenge side, I tried looking at the website, get my sense of the momentum. My sense is we're in more of a petition phase than an action phase. And it's great that some countries are signing on, but is a petition good enough given where we're at? I'm concerned that it might be too abstract and too negative for non-engaged Canadians. And because the moment calls for all of us to counter misinformation, disinformation, and greenwashing, what are the risks of attacking Canada's efforts, for example, by saying it's not succeeding, its emissions are not declining fast enough, it's not reaching its targets, it's an oil and gas exporter? What are the risks to building social efficacy around our ability to make progress? So let me close it off by that and stop sharing the screen and say one more time, sorry, I'm not able to give you the recipe book, the cookbook that says just do it this way. But that's where we're at, and the story as I can share it with you right now.
Wow. That is a bit scary. It's wonderful to have that information, especially hot off the press as it is. It's very important to have that information, and certainly, but it does make me think that we are talking about trust. When we talk about love, we're talking about both about kids, but we're talking about sharing that love in a compassionate way with a lot of people who disagree with us.
Yeah, exactly.
which we're not thinking about very often. And so that compassion, whether we call it love or compassion, is really going to be a test of our wisdom as we grow older and wiser, we hope. So that's a lot to think about, Louise, and I have to say, I trust you to tell us the truth. And I've always trusted you to tell us the truth because I know you. And then I realize, right, these guys don't. That's really too bad. But it makes me think Taylor Swift has a lot to do, really.
Yes.
We have to get her going.
I know.
Okay. Roy, are you coming back, or Because do we have questions in the chat here?
There's two. There's a Q&A and then the chat. I'm looking at the
Right.
Q&A,
I am
right
looking
now.
at the Q&A. So you're good at this, Louise. I'm not. I never did learn all this stuff.
That's
So
okay.
can we start with Letitia Charbonneau then? Does the fact that oil companies lied to us for decades help convince folks to hold them accountable?
Yeah, I might. I haven't tested it, so I can't say for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think that back to Susan's point around trust, calling somebody a liar is going a bit far for the less engaged part of the population. But you could say they haven't been completely honest, and that's costing us a lot. And they need to be held accountable. This is why one of the things that I'm going to say tomorrow to the group I'm with. So I actually think environmental groups have a really important role to play, countering misinformation and disinformation, but also calling out greenwashing. While we're giving the mic to other people who can talk more clearly about the impacts and their lived experiences and so on. So it's one of the things we're going to test more. But yeah, I think there's something on there. I just would watch how you do it. It's one thing to call somebody a liar than it is to say not being honest. Go after their character, right? Lying is, it's a character thing, but so is just being dishonest.
It's amazing to me that it can be so touchy for us to say that, and then you listen to Pierre Poilievre every day.
Yeah.
I mean, he has this huge base that likes that.
Yeah.
How do we...
I don't know. It is, I don't know.
Okay, Mike Nickerson. Hi, Mike. We could offer one upside for individuals. We move away from the consumer culture towards more engagement with the opportunities of living, learning, love, laughter, and like. Our common carbon emissions will decrease and personal fulfillment will go up.
Right.
It might be a way to get more interest.
I don't think so. So that's a very progressive activist, egalitarian, left-leaning perspective. Instead, what I found in the focus groups is challenging our lifestyles made people feel judged in a way they felt they didn't have much choice in how to change. I'm not saying we shouldn't have it, Mike. I think we really do need to have it, but that's a gentle entry point. For example, like, telling stories like, I'm time rich, right? I chose to, work less and have less so I could have more time. Like the challenge is to have that conversation in a way that isn't perceived as so judgmental. I was stunned to listen to people's reactions about our happy messaging around climate change action makes your life more affordable. It's like, they're not buying it. Like, I don't have any choices. My air conditioner is my air conditioner. I can't afford to change it. I can't change my furnace. I don't have money for the new car. Like, you're making me feel badly about myself. And so it's not incorrect. I agree that this is what we want to do, but we got to be so careful.
Thank you. So Sabina Cacciatore is next. I hope I said that correctly. How can we counter the message from oil and gas companies that have ads that rave about the benefits and job security that those industries bring?
I think here we have an opportunity to actually talk about how those jobs are not secure. So employment in the oil and gas sector has been going down. These stats are not hard to find. It's the one thing that we know from research in Alberta, that people are fed up to the teeth with boom and bust cycles. So they'd actually take less pay for more security, more stability. And I think that's a real avenue. But the other thing I mentioned about being humble about the solution side of it, I think we lose credibility because we go over the top on, good green paying jobs. Well, I can tell you most jobs in the renewable energy sector are not unionized because it's all through the private sector. They're not high paying, or not as high paying as the 150 grand they might be making in the oil sands. And they can often require movement from site to site, right? You're not actually working from your house. So again, we just want to be honest, because if we're 100% too positive, and like I can't remember who taught me this, but if you want to increase your credibility with someone that you're trying to bring along, like a civic national, who are my new people that I'm trying to think about all the time, the best thing for me to do is to acknowledge that they're right about something, right? The best thing for me to do is to acknowledge I might not know the answer. That humility and that ability to say, let's kind of talk it through together, is huge. So yeah, again, we need to take a bit of care in terms of how we make these big claims about all of these jobs. But it's not risky, if you will, to talk about stability and security.
Stability. Thank you. Last here is Nahid Azad. How do we encourage younger people to pay attention to climate change and pollution? I guess I wonder how many of people in the groups that you were doing were younger.
Yep. So we did have a range of age groups. It's true that the participants skewed older. That makes some sense. There were some younger people. And they were mixed because they came from the different tribes, right? So they were mixed in their perspectives. Housing attainability is actually first and foremost. At the same time, when it did come to the solutions, this word of mouth stuff's really important. And they were able to say, like, my parents have this stuff and it works. Their energy bills have gone way down. When the next time I have I have a plug-in hybrid, and it's fantastic. But you do see more conservatism in young people than we think. And this is where Pierre Poilievre has grabbed the market, if you will, because their near-term issue, and because they are dealing with so much fatalism, and this is why I think we need to be smart about our comms. Because if we're so over the top in our optimism and our enthusiasm, and not let any doubt or willingness to say that not everything's going to work perfectly first time around, you're not helping them with their fatalism, right? Because it's just not realistic. I mean, I heard it over and over and over and over again. And so we need to talk about what is realistic. What's realistic is we have to solve the climate change thing, and that's the key thing for the future. I want to say something about the young folks as well, and the question of justice, right? We often think that that's something that young people are really, after justice. They are. And it is about justice for future generations. My complaint about the climate dynamic and the treaty discussion is it is about historical responsibility. If we had not got into that trap in the 1990s and spent more of our time fighting about how countries like China and India, Brazil, and others were going to develop, instead of fighting about how we had developed, we might not be in the position that we're in right now. And so I think we do, if you're going to talk about climate justice, you're going to use that language, which nobody understands, you better be very clear about what you're talking about, and accept that there's a lot of anger and fatalism, and young people in particular kind of see it as the baby boomers kind of, have done us this bad deal. So we've got to find that opportunity to come together as well. How do we reach across? Talked about that before, my sadness about how our grandkids think we let them down.
Yeah, thank you. There's another anonymous question following that up about what's the role for schools and universities in educating the next generations, and particularly that they will inherit our failure to act well. But anyway, educating them, the schools and universities, are they not making any difference?
Yeah, they are. There is more climate change education going on in K to 12 as well as university. There's no doubt about that. We're graduating all sorts of folks with skills, but they're not necessarily the voting public yet. And so what we've failed to do is educate the people who actually matter right now, who are the voting public, and then getting people to vote on that issue. And so what we lack is a broad-based public education, engagement piece, climate change education, that kind of thing. And I just don't see that that's happening. And as a result, I think Poilievre has kind of won the day as a result, especially on things like carbon pricing.
And then Robin Collins is asking, the energy and industrial transition is falling behind. Many believe we need solar radiation, solar radiation modification, i.e. geoengineering. Here, some environmentalists and progressive activists are in opposition, arguing that this will displace the GHG reduction. Then, this is not what the engineers believe. They see the problem as far more dangerous than the activists. We need transition carbon capture and solar reflection technologies.
Right. So again, I think this is a bit of hype phase around and technology optimism at play. Yes, there will be a role for negative technologies, but ecological restoration is one part of that. Some of these other technologies like direct air capture or some of the things that you're talking about will be part of it, but I don't see anyone that believes it's credible to think that it's going to be the vast majority of reductions. I'm on the net zero advisory body, which advises the federal government, and most people think that these kinds of technologies, to the degree they work at all, would never represent more than 5% or so. So I don't think we have to dispute either side. We need it all, but we need it all in proportion. And I think certainly, at least the debates we're having on the net zero advisory body are where we have some very technology optimistic people agree that it'll be there, but it's not going to be all of what we have to do.
Thank you. And Ted Jackson wanted to ask, superb presentation, thank you. 2 specific questions. What is the potential of churches and other religious organizations for engaging multiple segments? And 2, what is the reception of the various groups to looking critically at the pollution effects of the plastics industry? Which of course is ultimately linked.
Exactly. Yeah. Great question. And because I only had 90 minutes in the focus group, I had to take out the stuff I wanted to test on plastics. But I agree. I think for the less engaged part of the population, recycling is where they're at. And we should be talking more about the oil and gas dynamics of plastics, because it's what they know. That is good communication, and we just aren't doing it. And so I'm just going to say yes to you there. On the churches and religious organizations, well, there's been a longstanding involvement. I mean, I think for me personally, without being a practicing Catholic, the most beautiful thing ever written, in my opinion, on climate change and what we have to do is the Laudato Si. There's just there's nothing else that it gets even close to what I think the heart of the matter is. And so, yes, there's a huge role there. I think that if we're talking about love, that's it. And I think that's a big part of what we need to profile more. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. You mentioned inspiring Canadians by sharing what other countries are doing. How would you play the US?
Yeah.
Or in China. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to have to test this out to see. But I think that there's just sometimes just some basic facts, right? Biggest investor in renewable energy in the world, China. Fastest growing market for EVs, China. All people hear about is coal plant. But the fact is, China's got a history of beating the targets that they set. And it looks like their peaking target is going to be set well in advance of their 20, whatever their date was, 60, which is ridiculous. And so again, not to go over the top being too, overly positive, but to list exactly, what's going on. There's no doubt the Americans with the Inflation Reduction Act, it's a game changer. And so, our biggest export customer, what are they doing? How are we trying to catch up? Why is it so important? All of that, I think, has value, and we just need to figure out what the 3 or 4 kind of most important things are to say, and then kind of be nice if everybody could kind of talk about it for a while.
Thank you very much. And Ruby Dagher, who's on our board, she's wondering, has the situation changed enough that we can no longer achieve major social behavior change like we did with smoking? Minimizing the impact and the misinformation is not new, but rabbit holes in social media are not helping. What else is limiting the impact of our social behavior change?
Yeah. So again, I'll deal with the social side of it. So very weak social norms, right? We've got to actually, and I really believe that this rise in trust in friends and family is our pathway to changing social norms. The most important thing we can do on climate change is talk to all the people we care about climate change, why we care about it, not in a judgmental way, not in an identity triggering way, but that this is how I feel, this is what I'm worried about, and find some way to share a conversation, connect on shared values. And so it's that social norms that people I know and love expect me to do the right thing on climate change, that people I know and love do something on climate change. So that's the key thing that we're missing. I did see in the focus groups a rise in distrust in social media, which is really interesting. I think we should play on that. I really think that this face-to-face emotional connection piece is a moment that we have an opportunity around that we might not have had before. Lifestyle change is not socialized. I'm sorry to say at the moment, we're vulnerable to that whole ridiculous category of woke and elitism, and all of you rich people who can afford to change. My son, who I call Joe Ken, says this to me all the time. You can afford it, Mom. Like, get off my back. Like, you have no idea. The other thing that we have to realize is that our culture has raised generation and generation to believe that being a good person is to be a good consumer. It's not something we just change overnight. And so, modeling and being joyful in our lower consumption, I would say we're all in denial. I don't think we can do the blame game here. Flying, right? Fastest growing source of household emissions anywhere. Everybody's traveling. If we didn't travel, we would see a big decline in emissions, but everybody feels they are entitled to travel and see the world. This is tricky territory and really challenging. For 30 years, I'm not sure we've made much progress on it, but what are we going to do? I mean, it is the reality. It is the culture that we deal in. And we are triggering judgmental reactions, identity reactions when we go down this. So all I can say is enter, because we have to, but be gentle. When I did my PhD, I interviewed over 300 people and different levels of engagement on climate change. And I must say that the greatest area of rationalization from the people who are what I would have considered the most activist environmentalists was flying. So we need to think about what we also model. That's all I'm going to say about that.
I hear ya. So here's a very practical short question. How would you approach a premier or his ministers who are planning to increase LNG for exports?
Welcome to New Brunswick. You must live at home. You live where I live. So it is a ridiculous idea. I think the way we're going to win that is actually because there are no international rules that would ever recognize that. And of course, in New Brunswick, we have a very strong opposition within our Indigenous communities, which, while on nuclear, they're very keen on many of the tribes are keen on SMRs. We don't see the same thing on LNG. So I think it's something that just won't happen. Some topics I just don't bother wasting my breath on, and this is one of them. It's just never going to happen.
Great.
But
not.
but the story on LNG and getting credit in China and coal and all of that, it does need to be challenged, and there are opportunities to do that. The rules just don't. It's never going to work. Yeah.
And the last one I have at the moment is Kelly asking, why do you think the current government has failed in effectively promoting, and she says carbon tax, I say anything to do with climate change, and and that's in the past, but is there anything they can do now, or are their credibility shot?
Yeah. When this government first came into power, they should have launched a massive investment in public engagement and education, but they didn't. So it's too late now. They never prepared the ground for what carbon pricing is and what it's for, and created the impression that it was all there. They should have never said a word about it. And unfortunately for me, being a person who also does policy work, who would have expected COVID? Who would have expected the supply chain nightmare and the rise in inflation and cost of living? Nobody expected that. Everybody assumed this was going to be, small little increases over time. And the fact of the matter is consumers are paying a carbon price on 100% of their emissions. And industry, depending on where you are and the system that you're operating under, is essentially paying a carbon price on less than 20% of their emissions, depending on where you are, because of the way it's been designed. The system is not fair. The industrial price is already responsible for more than, I think it's 2/3 or something of the impact of the carbon price. It needs to be strengthened. And we need to say a lot more about the industrial price. And frankly, if I were in charge, I would drop the carbon price, primarily, if I had to, the consumer price. I would drop that particularly on low to moderate income households, because frankly, household emissions are primarily driven by upper income households. They have the bigger houses, the bigger cars, they take more trips. It's not my dad, let me tell you, in this little bungalow. So I don't believe the carbon price on consumers is that helpful. But I do think the industrial system needs to be strengthened, and I do think high income, high polluting households and consumers do need to pay the price. So they can change it, make it more fair, but they've backed themselves in a corner. Prime Minister saying over my dead body, and it will be. Yeah, and it will be.
Yeah, it will be. That's for sure.
Yeah.
There are a number of people who are wondering about your slide deck, Louise.
Yeah.
They've seen the time passing and that there are still more questions, but is there I know you've just done a lot of this research, so we're very lucky to have it fresh. Will there be an article? How do you feel about your slide deck being?
Yeah, you can have the deck. You're getting the presentation before everybody else tomorrow. What I would do, though, is just get Mo to PDF it. I just sent it as it was, but PDF it before you send it out. We will be doing a webinar at Re.Climate once I've gotten all the feedback. We are putting out a primer, a playbook, if you will, and toolkits and different, I don't know. Apparently, I'm writing a lot of different products. I haven't figured them all out yet. But
wow, that's a lot.
It is. So in May, June, there'll be stuff. Lots and lots of stuff, webinar and all that kind of thing. So obviously you'll hear about that. Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. We do want to hear about that because, of course, a deck is one thing, but having you talk around it is a whole other thing. Yeah.
Exactly.
Although that's another question I should ask you. We do post our seminars on our website.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. You mean the webinar recording?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's terrific. Well, there seem to be a lot of questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it to see.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what your time is like.
We have a few minutes. Yeah. I'm going to run. Yeah.
So why don't you pick one or two of those in the chat, because I've just obscured them. And it's just all right. Or do you want to just a couple of the topics?
No, I'm just going through. Yeah. Annual policy. Okay, so you're just talking there about the non-proliferation treaty. I'll just leave that go. So there's some repeat there.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of repeat. Yeah.
Hold on a sec. Toolkit, good. I see got some good posting there. Oh, the reference that somebody did post the Laudato Si. If you want to post that, yeah, you've got it there from the Vatican. It's just, that's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful thing. Gwen Dyer. Yes. Okay, Gwen Dyer. I'm just looking here. Yes, Gwen Dyer is talking about some of those geoengineering type approaches. As I say, there'll be something. We do need to realize we actually live on one planet. We live together, and one country just can't go off and start doing things in the atmosphere. And I think that there will be lots of issues that have to be dealt with around what's appropriate there. I always thought that young people cared about the environment, but the increase in online shopping proves they don't. They have sacrificed the environment for convince. Back to Mike Nickerson's point, the power of culture, right? We've been trained to consume. It's our identities. And so, yeah, I am not a cultural change expert. I can just do my little part, try to understand the things. I can tell you, as a person who leads what I try to lead, a low carbon lifestyle. Grow our own food. We never travel by plane for holiday. I travel for work, and I feel sick about it. I have had more influence on people and their lifestyle choices from that role model. And I can only tell you, as social creatures, role model, be the change you want to see. That's it. And often what we do is, well, it's not our fault. It's the oil and gas industry. They leave us no choice, that kind of thing. Let's not rob each other of our agency. Every ton matters. It really does. The carbon budget's small and it's declining rapidly. And so what? So what if my ton is small? It's my ton and I did my bit and it's something. That doesn't mean I'm letting anybody else off the hook. And I don't. I mean, my activism shows that. But to be authentic is important. And, you hear it all the time. Well, David Suzuki's got his big houses. He's driving all over the place. He's flying everywhere. I think we have to be the change we want to see. So maybe leave it there.
That is, and it's an excellent point on which to end our excellent seminar. Thank you so much, Louise. That was fascinating and terrifying and inspiring. Thank you very much. And
You're
good
welcome.
luck with tomorrow in Waco.
Okay, thank you. All right, take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.